all the time. It becomes the setting for their daily life and their meditations. Ahmad ibn Hanbal, may Allah be pleased with him, and we should note here that in the Sufi tradition, all of the great legal imams, Abu Hanifa, Malik, Ash-Shafi'i, Ahmad ibn Hanbal, Sufyan al-Thawri, and many others that you may or may not know of, Abu Thawr, these are all regarded to be Sufi masters. And that is not plagiarism or alteration, of history. That's the reality. Again, they keep inward what in some, like Maulana Jalaluddin, will be made outward as a mercy to humankind. They may not speak that. Malik himself, may Allah be pleased with him, who is the heir of Medina, is said to have taught, "Man tasharra'a wa lam yatahaqqaq tafassaq," that whoever lives by the Sharia alone, the outward law, but does not imbibe the haqiqah, the inner metaphysical reality, the inner truth, becomes corrupt, becomes a deviant. And whoever وَمَنْ تَحَقَّقَ وَلَمْ يَتَشَرَّعْ تَزَنْدَقْ, and whoever takes in those inner metaphysical truths, the haqiqah, but does not put on the armor of the prophetic law, does not live by the law as they did, he will become a heretic, a zindiq, which is worse than a fasiq. وَمَنْ تَشَرَّعَ وَتَحَقَّقْ فَقَدْ تَحَقَّقْ. But whoever takes on the outward law and the haqiqah, he will have the haqiqah. Or he will also, tasawwuf, in another transmission, he will be a real Sufi. And Imam Malik lived in the time of the first great Sufis like Ibrahim ibn Adham and others. Whether Imam Malik actually said this or not, scholars will disagree. They do not disagree that this is a statement that goes back to his time, and it is a statement that he would have endorsed, as was endorsed by the other great masters of that time. So Ahmad ibn Hanbal, he says, do not look for separate passages of the Quran in order to juxtapose them as if they were in contradiction. This is often what people do. But he said, read the Quran from the beginning to the end, and then from the beginning to the end, and then from the beginning to the end, and take it all in. And this is the way they did. This is especially the way the Sufis did. By the way, we should note that Al-Hallaj, may Allah have mercy on him, who is one of the very important pivotal figures in making the reality of Sufism part of the texture of Islamic civilization. And we can talk about that at another time. But what school did Al-Hallaj follow? He was a Hanbali. He was a very strict follower of the school of Ahmad ibn Hanbal. And there are many others, many of the great Persian Sufis, also like Al-Ansari, they're also Hanbalis. The great Sheikh Abdul Qadir al-Jilani, may Allah be pleased with him and give us the blessing of the mentioning of his name. He was the master of the Hanbali school, as he was also the master of the Shafi'i school. And he was able to give fatwas in both. He was a master of all outward knowledge. All of the recitations of the Quran, the hadith, the ilm of fatwa, the differences of opinion of the scholars, and so forth. And, but he is a Hanbali. And so again, we have to emphasize this fact. The idea that somehow the Sufis excuse themselves from the burdens of the law, this is a total misrepresentation of what that tradition is like. Again, there's no way, as the Sufis would say, the haqiqah, which is this ultimate reality, this ultimate truth, it is in the Sharia, like butter is in the milk. If you don't have full milk, you can't have butter. But to get the butter, you've got to churn the milk. And so that's what they do. They live that life, they churn that milk, and then they get this precious butter. Imam al-Ghazali, in Ihya Ulumuddin, this incredible work, Imam al-Ghazali is of course a master of the masters. And Shaykh Abdul Qadir al-Jilani, who comes later, they're of the same generation, when al-Ghazali is leaving Baghdad to take his 11-year spiritual journey in which he'll write Ihya Ulumuddin, just as he leaves the city, this beautiful young boy from Gilan, from the Caspian Sea of Sunni Persia, at the order of his mother Fatima, Allah bless her, he comes into the city. That's Shaykh Abdul Qadir al-Jilani, 17 years old. And he will spend the next 40 years in rigid discipline, mastering the outward sciences, mastering the inward training. And then really in many ways, Shaykh Abdul Qadir al-Jilani, he will apply the program of Imam al-Ghazali. And Imam al-Ghazali is the master of this. In fact, if we were to talk about Ihya Ulumuddin, he's very careful to always keep the book on the level of the ordinary Muslim. He never wants to speak in Ihya Ulumuddin at a level that only he could understand, or only Mawlana Jalaluddin or Mawlana Shams at-Tabrizi could understand. He'll always take you to that door. He'll always say, there it is. If you want to go through the door, you're welcome. But he won't take you through the door in Ihya Ulumuddin. He will simply bring you to it. But I wanted to emphasize that the Quran is always for the Sufis this presiding rule, this germinating idea. They live in it. They never leave it. A great sheikh that I had the honor to be with for 19 years, my first primary sheikh, Sheikh Muhammad Abu Bakr, may God have mercy on him, our wonderful sister Adiba knew him well. And of course, Sheikh Abdul Samad was also one of his disciples. But he would complete the Quran every 3 days. I don't think he slept, but he lived the Quran. Every 3 days he does a khatam, every 3 days. And again, it's like the Quran just impregnates him. He embodies it. It shines forth from him. So I wanted to emphasize these things. I think it's very, very important. And therefore also the Sufis become the masters of synthetic interpretation. And again, if we were to study the Quran, there are many different approaches to it. May Allah enable all of us to live in the springtime, the verdant springtime of the Quran. May He make it the verdant springtime, Rabi'a, of our hearts, as we say. And in that, may you have to taste the beauty of the Arabic language which is the most ancient and the most pure form of Semitic speech known to human beings. All forms of Semitic speech and related forms of speech, like that of Pharaonic Egypt, very close to Semitic, all of them are Middle Semitic compared to Arabic. Arabic is an ancient, pure Semitic tongue, preserved by the Arabian Peninsula, preserved by the Abrahamic custom of pilgrimage and sacred months. But it was a language that was created perfectly in order to be the receptacle of the Quran forever. So we know what that language means, and may you also be able to taste that language and to delve into it. But the Sufis, more than anyone else, are able to put it all together and to have these synthetic readings, which are also the very foundation, really, of Islamic science and of Islamic civilization. So the Sufi masters always sought istinbat, to take water, to draw water out of the earth, deduction, induction, from their khatam, from their recitation of the Quran from beginning to end, which they always repeat. especially from uninterrupted and repeated recitation. And this was very common among them, as this was also very common among the Salaf. When I began my study at the University of Chicago a long time ago, one of the books that I read first was History of Judges. And there's a book, History of Judges of Egypt by Kindi. And there are other books. And I encountered this unbelievable statement many times in reading about these early Muslim judges of the 1st and 2nd and 3rd Islamic centuries, that they would read the Quran every night in its totality, and that some of them would read it every night 3 times. And it's like, I don't want to disbelieve that, because I have the gift of being very credulous, thank God. I'm not a skeptical person. It's easy for me to believe. But, so I don't want to disbelieve, but how is that possible? And of course our dear brother Shams was talking about the footstep, how the Sufis were able to take a step into time. And he mentioned a great sheikh that he knew who was in Medina and said, I need to pray Maghrib, which is an hour away in Mecca. And so he stepped into the crowd and disappeared. It said Imam Nawawi, who was one of the great qutubs of Islam, an amazing man, that he would pray Maghrib in Medina, he would pray Isha in Mecca, he would pray Fajr in Jerusalem, and then he'd be back in Damascus to teach. Is that possible? Well, you know it's not possible. It's miraculous. It's miraculous. And things like that are possible for the Lord of time and place, the Lord of time and space. There was a great Sheikh Ahmed ibn Idris, who we have the honor to also have his chain of transmission. He was one of the great masters of the 18th and early 19th century. The Sanusi movement will come out of him, and others. And he was talking about how the Sufis could recite the Quran in a very short time. And a particular scholar of outward knowledge was there, and he just couldn't believe that. And he doubted it, but again, he had adab, so he didn't want to show that doubt. But Sheikh Ahmed ibn Idris could see that he doesn't believe it. He doesn't know how that's possible. So they say the next day, Sheikh Ahmed ibn Idris, who was in Mecca, he was making tawaf around the Kaaba in the last third of the night. And this beautiful scholar came in. And so Sheikh Ahmed took him by the hand, and he recited to him the entirety of the Quran, from Al-Fatiha to An-Nas in Tartil. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Better than that. From Al-Fatiha to An-Nas, between the black stone and the door of the Kaaba. That's what, about 10 steps. So you know, but he just wanted, he took him into that realm. So these are the gifts that God gave these great people. And if you believe in that, then you are a wali of Allah. And this is real. This is possible. And these people exist. And people like Maulana Jalaluddin Rumi, their praise will exist until the end of the world. And the status that they have in the next world, you and I cannot imagine. We want to put ourselves under the shade of their tree and never leave that shade. Ghazi Uthman, may Allah be pleased with him, who is the founder of the Ottoman dynasty, which is one of the greatest ever. And where in the history of kings or sultans will you find anything like the House of Uthman? Tell me, where will you find that? I'd like to know. There are great kings in history. Cyrus the Great, who released the Jews from captivity and built the Second Temple. Quraysh, as he's called in Hebrew. Quraysh. You know, Cyrus was great. And he is like Dhul Qarnayn. No one is more like the archetype of Dhul Qarnayn than Cyrus the Great. And he's great, and so were many of his successors. But Ghazi Uthman had a dream in which a light came out, like the moon, came out of the heart of his sheikh, and then it came into his heart. And then a sycamore tree grew up. And for the Ottomans, the sycamore tree was almost like a sacred symbol. Wherever they would go, they would plant the sycamore. And you see this if you go to Turkey. I've seen sycamores that are 600 years old, where the Ottomans were. But the sycamore tree then came out, and it spread its limbs to the east, west, north, and the south, and it shaded all the nations of the earth. They all came to live in the protection and the shade of that tree. And they said that the light is his sheikh, and it's his sheikh's daughter whom he marries, and then out of that begins the great family. But Maulana Jalaluddin Ar-Rumi is the tree that shades the tree. May we take that in, may we drink that water, the water of the unseen, and may it bring us to life. And may it enable us then to be lights that live that and that take that to others. Bi-idhnillahi ta'ala.